Welcome to Spoken Word, John McMullen. Since this is my first a video book, I'm going to decorate it to. I'm going to dedicate it to a friend of mine of 75 years, Dan Sheehan, whose wife just passed away after 60 years of marriage, and and Dan honored me by asking me to do a eulogy at, at the funeral luncheon. So away we go. David asked for a theme. The theme is the fork in the road. The fork in the road, the great philosopher L.P. Barrow, known to his friends and fans as Yogi, had many memorable expressions. No one goes there anymore. It's too crowded. It gets late early out there, referring to the left field shadow at Yankee Stadium. It ain't over till it's over, and many more. My favorite of all is when you come to the fork in the road, take it. To me, that bit of wisdom has always meant when faced with a decision, make it. Sometimes the forks aren't clearly marked, and I've been very lucky in the past, which I chose to wander down. It was a Saturday morning 60 years ago. I was driving to friend for us to take the government test, only because he asked me. Doing this led eventually into the 50-year career with computers, something I knew nothing about at the time and had zero interest. When you come to the fork in the road, take it. Years later, I made the presentation to a potential client. And while we didn't make a sale, I became very impressed with the female member of the evaluation team. 7 years later, I received a call from a client asking if I knew the same woman who was now applying for a job with the firm. I strongly recommended if she got the job, then coincidentally, I joined the same firm shortly thereafter. That was 45 years ago. Although it meant us both leaving over 10-year marriages and changing career paths, we've been married for 44 years. When you come to the fork in the road, taken. We were starting our own consulting business, working with large computer systems, mainframes. But when the friend saw us standing by an elevator and came over to wish us luck, he asked if we had seen the computer on Ben Rosen's desk. We hadn't and didn't know who Ben Rosen was, but we were off to see him in the research department. He was an electronics analyst, and the computer was an Apple II. It didn't do much at the time, but I bought one to see how these new devices could work on our business. 2 months later, the first spreadsheet ever, VisiCalc, was introduced. We had an early copy. There was tremendous demand for training. We were the only game in town, and our business changed totally from a mainframe consulting business to concentrate on the new world of personal computing. When you come to the fork in the road, take it. The connection with Ben Rosen was now a good one, paid off when he invited us to a conference in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and we met the developers of VisiCalc, Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankson. When returning from an upstate New York consulting job, we stopped for dinner at a restaurant, Plumbush's. There was only one other party in the dining room, an older couple. When I heard one mention Apple, I jumped in and we talked about computing. And as the conversation ended, he told me that I should join the Apple user group in New York City and told me about all that it did. So I did. And I wound up becoming its president for 9 years. When you come to the fork in the road, take it. Because of our connections there, the dean at NYU asked us to teach a course. And that led to, over the last 43 years, teaching in 10 colleges between us. In the meantime, then that's a popular computing magazine, asked Dan Bricklin to write an article about how business people use VisiCalc. He demurred, but suggested the editor speak to Barbara McMullen, who knew more about this than anyone. He did, and while we had no plans to be writers, we've been writing publication for over 40 years. When it comes to the fork in the road, taken. Even though I was an English literature major and read constantly fiction and nonfiction and wrote constantly from magazines and newspapers now, I had no interest in poetry, had neither written nor read any for 35 years. However, one day, walking through an aisle in Barnes & Noble, I came across a book with a strange title. I took it off the shelf and back to my table. It was by a fellow named Charles Bukowski. I opened it and saw his poetry. Although my reaction was, ugh, I read some of it and felt that Bukowski was an alcoholic, a misogynist, and crazed, but also brilliant. I also decided that if this lunatic can do this, I can too. That was 15 years ago. Now I have hundreds of poems published in magazines, journals, and anthologies, 10 books of poetry, and I'm the poet laureate of the third 6,000 citizen town in Westchester, New York. Many paths, many choices to be made. I took the fork in the road. Now, much of my poetry, as the people who have seen here, is narrative poetry about my life, about basketball, about politics, about poetry. So and what I'm going to read is going to be much the same. Now, starting off, it's always where you came from and the neighborhood culture. I was born and raised in the Inwood section of New York City, at the very top of Manhattan Island. It was an Irish Catholic Jewish section then. Each group thought the neighborhood belonged to them, and they were both right. It has three claims to fame then: a giant park with a large real forest, Columbia University's football stadium, and more bars than any neighborhood in New York City. People came from all over to watch football, play in the park, and drink in the bars. Walter Winchell called it Ginwood in the press and on the radio. The legal drinking age in New York then was 18, so we could start in the park at 15 or 16. When I first tasted beer, I didn't like it. That soon changed. We moved to the bars at 17 or 18. Whether in the park or in the bars, the beer was the catalyst. It was a conversation that bonded us. In the words of the great sportscaster Jimmy Cannon, I stopped drinking 25 years ago. I retired with the title. I knew a number who fell into the bottle. Most did not. We became engineers, lawyers, accountants, writers, and technologists. Were it not for the half-quart cans of Pabst and the advent of the desktop computer, I never would have become a writer. So I owe a lot to the neighborhood and to the culture. I go back once a month for a luncheon. There are now very few bars. The neighborhood is Dominican at one end and gentrified and expensive at the other. The times in the stores may be different, but the friendships and memories live on. My Inwood is now the state of the mind. There were some real characters from the neighborhood, and many of you have heard the story. From an Inwood bar to a great book by way of the Vietnam War. November 1967, the story begins in Doc Fiddler's. The anti-war protests were heating up, and some of my old neighborhood weren't having any of it. The super patriot bartender, the big crazy, was one of the most upset. The guys over there will think we don't support them. So he seized on a plan. Someone's got to go over there and buy them a beer. What? Go over there? He had it all worked out. He was going to borrow merchant seaman papers from a friend of mine and go himself. The friend, John Chick Donahue, only the less crazy at the time, knew they couldn't give up his papers, so he said, I'll go. And so he did, with the list of locals serving and a lot of beer on an ammo ship, the SS Drake. On January 19th, 1968, the Drake anchored in Quinai, and Chick was off on his adventure. And 40 years later, it became a book. The book, the story of him hitching through a war zone in a Madras shirt that made officers think he was CIA. The story of him conning officers that he was looking for his stepbrother to tell him that their mother had died. The story of him finding one local almost as soon as they got off the ship and thinking it would be easy for the rest. The story of him finding an ammo base and actually being picked up in the Jeep by another because he was hitching. The story got more serious when he reached the fourth on the front lines and was issued a weapon when the enemy was sighted. The story got even more serious when he missed his ship departure and went to Saigon to look for another and got caught in the Tet Offensive. He eventually found another ship, which took him to Seattle and the plane back to New York and the cab back to Doc Fiddler's. Since then, he has owned a bar, worked for years as a Sandhog, and got an MPA from Harvard without having a college degree. Hopefully, I've whet your appetite. The book is the greatest beer ever, by Chick Donahue and J.T. Malloy. Go on Amazon and buy the book, and then see the movie. Then we move a little on. The triumphant return. Recently, the 222 Toronto Film Festival opened. I've never been in Toronto, but the close friend and hearing live the story has been there. It was the Friday night in the mid 1950s, and four of us were sitting in the very secluded part of Inwood Park talking and consuming many cans of beer. One of the group, Christian John Charles, but known to all his chickies, said, "Hey, I met a girl who wanted me to go to a dance tonight at Visitation, so let's all go." Visitation was the church 25 miles north of our present location, and the other three of us had absolutely no idea no interest in making such a trip. But he kept at it, and when the beer ran out, we grabbed a cab and we're on the way. When we got there, we were surprised to see so many other of our Inwood friends there, as well as the large number of locals. All went well until one of my traveling companions won a dance contest, and two other Inwoodites finished second and third. The locals took umbrage at the Inwood exuberance, and a fight broke out, spilling up the stairs and out into the parking lot. When the locals appeared to be losing the encounter, they sent out for reinforcements to the local bowling alley, and the fight went on. Finally, the number of police cars arrived and everyone scattered. Two friends and I escorted some girls we knew through an enemy lines and out of the area. The third friend, the one who brought us there, for some reason thought that he might be subject to arrest and began to hitchhike to get out of the area. He stopped running when he felt face, or perhaps sobered up in Toronto. Now, however, he is faced with a new plan. No money, and it dawned on him that he was in Toronto, Canada. His parents had told him, whatever, in a strange place and in trouble, to go to the nearest Catholic rectory and seek help. He did, and long-suffering parents used to more trouble with him than the other five siblings, took a phone call from the priests and arranged to send plane fare in order to reclaim their son. Now, their son has returned to Toronto as the co-author of the basis of the movie, The Greatest Beer Run Ever, the tale of his delivery of the beer to friends fighting in Vietnam. He told me that he did not tell anyone that he had previously been there, but now you know the rest of the story. One of the people who was with us drinking in the park was a fellow named Mike. Michael Robert Ryan was my best friend for a very long time. We had mutual interests: books, radio, sports, and a shared taste for beer. We talked constantly in the park, in the bar, on the phone for years. Knowing nothing about computers when graduating from college, having no interest in knowing, we both spent all of our working lives working with them. We worked together for two firms, in good terms and bad terms, and not destroyed our friendship. He had red hair, a quick smile, a terrific Irish tenor voice, would sing Danny Boy, both at any request and at every wedding of my friend and mine. I was his best man and gave the toast at his wedding and a eulogy at his funeral, another victim of Joe Camel. 6 months wonder. I was too young for Korea, although I have a friend whose older brother died there. I was too old for Vietnam, though I had friends whose younger brothers died there. I was working as a civilian for the Department of the Army, and there was pressure to get my military obligation out of the way. So I spent from November 1962 through May 1963 in Fort Nix, New Jersey, and Fort Sill, Oklahoma, as a 6 month wonder. I hated it. It was boring, repetitious, and an awful lot of chicken shit. I wanted to get on with my life. It was only later that I got to realize how much I learned in just those few months. The Irish Catholic from New York City, working with the Protestant from Alabama who thought that the Pope was a heretic. The college English major found common ground with high school dropouts who that reading was a big waste of time. The local gym rat and fanatic found the same teamwork as part of an artillery crew. The kid from the lily white neighborhood of Inwood saw his black platoon buddies suffer bigotry and exclusion in Lawton, Oklahoma. The tedium of spit shining shoes and cleaning a rifle with a toothpaste made me do things right. It was only much longer that I found the interest in my constant question, what is this good training for? The answer was for life. I was a basketball whore. I played in the park. I played CYO ball. I played for an Episcopal church. I played in a league of the Jewish Y. I played intramural ball in college. I was a proverbial gym rat in college, playing between classes, and often when I should have been in class. I went to Iona College. I really majored in basketball and Beachmont. The Beachmont is the bar across the street from the college. I grew up small and only grew late in college. I was a good player, then for a while, a very good player, then a pretty good player, then a good player again, and finally an okay player when I stopped playing in my early 60s. I played in leagues in Wall Street. I played in open leagues around Manhattan and the Bronx. I played in leagues at Westchester and pickup for 2 hours most Sunday mornings. Now I have regular cortisone shots in my hips and knees. I've had minor surgery in both knees and jelly pumped into them. No cartridge in my knees or ankles. Arthritis all through my back, hips, and ankles. And my right ankle has a limp and constant pain. My orthopedist, plagued himself, says it's all from basketball. If I'd only known then, back in my basketball days, what I know now, I wouldn't have changed a fucking thing. And then after reading the Bukowski poem, by the way, I'm wearing a Charles Bukowski t-shirt, I decided to write one poem and just see how it worked. It was called Cashing a Check. I saw this wonderful line in a column in a motorcycle magazine. The mind writes checks that the body can't cash. The vision that many from my old neighborhood have of me is short and thin with a Pepsi in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Others will remember me as tall and thin, hitting a jumper from the corner or throwing a no-look pass to a cutout. Others will picture me at the end of the bar in the Broadstone with an open pack of Pall-Malls and a half-finished beer on the bar. Don Gibson, I Can't Stop Loving You on his jukebox. Pat, one more when you get a chance. Age is taking the jumper. Diabetes is taking the Pepsi. Common sense is taking the cigarette and the booze. I'm older and wiser and hopefully more tolerant. I'm satisfied with my life. But to be able to once more fake the man guarding me, go up with a jumper and get nothing but net, to be able once more to cash that check. I probably wouldn't have done anything but these poems, but I happened to show them to a woman friend of mine who was a school teacher and a fellow I went to college with, and they both encouraged me, particularly the woman. And years later, I wrote a poem about it. Taller, prettier, smarter. I was talking to an old friend the other day. She told me that she has lung cancer, which seemed treatable. I said, I don't remember, did you smoke? She answered, absolutely. It made me taller, prettier, smarter. She always had a way with words. We felt this way when we were young and naive, partially because the media portrayed smoking as cool and sexy. Humphrey Bogart, one of my favorites, always seemed to have a cigarette hanging from his lips. I remember him lighting one in his own mouth and then passing it to his dinner companion, probably Lauren Bacall, for her to smoke. Without recognizing how Freudian this was, I thought it was the coolest thing. Bogart died at the age of 58 of cancer of the esophagus. Afterward, the taller, prettier, smarter woman, Jacqueline Wolfe Birch, died on June 18th, 2022, the victim of fucking Joe Camel. She was smart, funny, and tough. I will miss her. I miss her already. I mentioned I write a lot of political things, and I'll only read one here because it was written in 2009 before most of the people in the world hadn't heard of him. Donald Trump, 2009. Maybe I'm not the only person who hates Donald Trump. In today's New York Post, columnist Cindy Adams writing about Henry Hudson scribed, anyway, he sailed up the river and like Trump right away named the thing after him. At the top of my hill, there is the Donald Trump State Park, Indian Hill section, and there is nothing there, only a closed gate. Trump's company had bought land years ago, hoping to rezone down from 4 acres and to build condos, but the locals fought him and fought him and fought him. So finally he gave up and gave it to New York State with the stipulation that it be named after him. Big signs went up all over the highway, bigger than the exit signs. And he took his tax write-off and went home, but there was only a locked gate. I wonder if he will rename hell when he gets there. And then from there, I go back to writing about basketball a little. A poem is not a jump shot. I've done at least one thing perfectly in my life. I've faked my man, gone up in the air and gotten nothing but net. Perfect. Now I write poetry. And no matter how happy I am with a poem, it is never perfect. It can always be tweaked, have words added or cut or changed, never really finished, never perfect. But sometimes I have to pause, to stop, and just get poems out the door. And that is a submission. And then poetry became my new basketball. From the time I was 12 to over 60, basketball was the one constant in my life. It took me through changes in schools, aspirations, careers, marriages, parenthood, residence. I was small in high school and only grew up too late to play in college. That didn't stop me though, and I played for over 50 years. I only consulted, taught, and wrote columns in technology for about 5 years, and then through a quirk, poetry entered my life, grabbed me by the throat and consumed me. Other than my wife and children, it's become the number one thing in my life. In short, it's become the basketball of my mature life. But basketball gave me what's known as a fura, A-R-F-U-R-A, a really fucked up right ankle. No tendons or ligaments, arthritis, bone spurs that won't keep me out of the army, and a ruptured tendon in my leg. Additionally, I've had 2 minor knee operations, jelly pumped into both knees annually, arthritis in both hips. While it was all worth it, basketball has stripped my body. Will poetry do the same to my brain? Important people. Over the years, through no fault of my own, I've been around many important people. I have held Eleanor Roosevelt's coat, lit Gordon McCrae's cigarette, talked baseball with Casey Stingwell, talked football with Weeb Eubank, exchanged pleasantries with Pearl Bailey, basked in the presence of Lena Horne, interviewed Steve Jobs, discussed history with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., been in the room with Lauren Bacall, reminisced about my late father with ex-NYC Mayor Bob Wagner, talked writing with George Plimpton and with David Halberstam, speculated about technology with Bill Gates, talked basketball and politics with Governor George Pataki. But the most important person with whom I've ever spent any time with is Barbara E. McMullen, my wife of 44 years. I was going to read a much longer poem about Barbara, but I'm a little over, so I'll conclude without reading that, but know it was on my mind with I have to spin by it on this book to the last poem. If you had told me 58 years ago, on June 3rd, 1964, when I was working on Wall Street and getting ready to move to the Tony Riverdale section of New York City, that today I'd be married for 44 years to a woman I didn't know at the time. I was engaged to another woman at that time, living in a in our 250-year-old barn home. I was a lifetime apartment dweller and plan to remain as such. On the share of a lake, Osceola, that I spent a week at when 9 years old and forgotten that it existed. Then a town I had never heard of in New York, Yorktown. I thought it was in Virginia. And that I would be the poet laureate of the town and have 10 books published after vowing after college never to read another poem and succeeding for 35 years. If you had told me that then, I would have thought you crazy. Now I wonder if just me. A lot of forks in that road and a wonderful life. And as I say every week, thank you for putting up with me.